Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 63. Today on the show, I have a special interview for you with Coach Jon McLernon. I've been holding on to this episode for a little while and honestly thought about not publishing it due to some background noise, interference that comes up at different points. However, when I went back and listened to the interview recently, I felt like Coach Jon's story of how he got to a place of forgiveness was so powerful that I wanted you guys to hear it, because he went through something that no one should ever have to go through, and it was traumatic, and he talks about how he coped with that in a negative way, and then how he came to forgiveness, how he got back on track. It's just a really great personal story. The reality is that if you've been living and breathing for any amount of time on this earth, there's been someone that's hurt you that you've needed to forgive. And hopefully this episode will help you with that process. Jon, you had a traumatic experience, and that really changed the trajectory of your life. Tell us about that.
My wife and I had sort of embarked on a global globe-trotting adventure, I guess you could say. And we spent about 3 years of our life just traveling around the world. And one of the places that we landed in was South Africa. We'd met some South Africans in our travels, and they'd invited us to come down to South Africa to help them work on a particular, it was a government program. It was an NGO, like government funded but privately run. It was called Hospitality Youth Initiative. And so what we were doing is we were working with underprivileged young people, kind of teaching them life skills and helping them to be more employable, and then placing them in internships for basically with potential employers to give them a chance to prove themselves. At that time, we were out living on a nature reserve, Eastern Cape in South Africa. And one night I had went back to our cabin. Kind of the layout of the reserve was the buildings were kind of lined up in a bit of an L shape. So you had like the dining hall on one end. Then there was the dormitories for the students, and then there was like the washroom facilities, and tucked into the woods a little bit was off to the side was the instructor's cabin. And so I'd been walking back there. Everyone else was in the dining hall, enjoying dinner and whatnot. It should have clicked, but it didn't, because I was out there. Everything's peaceful and quiet. That something was amiss, but the door was ajar to the cabin. And when I opened it, there was 3 men in there that were actually sitting down and eating food at our table, and it didn't really register with me that something was amiss. There was a 4th guy outside the cabin I didn't see, who hit me over the head with a rock, and it stunned me and so on. So essentially their intention was to try to beat me to death, basically. That was quite a really traumatic thing to go through. I'm kind of skipping over some of the details, probably for the sake of brevity as well. But in an incident like that, I don't think anything in life really properly prepares you to experience something like that. Some of the things that stick out of my mind were like they were smiling and laughing, and that, while they were inflicting this on me.
And these were people that you didn't know, and they didn't know you.
Not.
And all of a sudden they're trying to kill you, basically.
Yeah, I'd sort of stumbled across them. I believe they'd ransacked our cabin and whatnot, but it turns out the night before they had to actually beaten to death a farmer that they'd robbed. And so they were kind of on this spree of doing this. And so it was nothing personal about me and the individual. It just so happened to be where they were. But there's also kind of a reason why they would do things the way they do, interestingly, in a sense. And that is that they could have just, say, shot me or stabbed me or something like that. But in a sense, being that I was white, I am a representation of something they feel had historically oppressed them. And so in an interesting twist, it's kind of like they're trying to take back something they feel was taken from them. They want to inflict kind of punishment and demonstrate their power over you and really make you suffer in the experience. It kind of speaks to the place that they might be at psychologically. And maybe that worked to my advantage, because I was able to I was stunned and concussed and bloodied and bruised and so on, but I was able to kind of fight my way to my feet and at least escape to where the others were. The aftermath of that was nothing that I was really prepared for. I come from Canada. We have our, ups and downs and our issues, but we're a pretty open, friendly country. I had a lot of kind of intrusive thoughts enter my mind, a lot of unprovoked or unexpected emotions that would come on very, very strongly, thoughts of doing harm or violence to other people and so on. That's not who I am as a human being. That in itself was incredibly troubling and difficult for me to deal with, because the logical part of my brain says this is not who I am. And yet here these thoughts are coming into my head. I'm being triggered by things that would never have in the past triggered me. And so I really felt quite unequipped to deal with that. And one of my ways of coping was actually to use food to kind of, I call it change the channel in my head. I shouldn't say kind of. I became a binge eating food addict, essentially. And that was one of my coping mechanisms.
Okay, so there was just a lot of intense anger after this trauma, and part of that was just your mind, like, trying to make sense of everything that happened to you. Like, it was like this double whammy of, here I am essentially sacrificing some time and energy to help people in this humanitarian organization, and then I'm seen as like this racial enemy that gets beaten, and you're not a racist person.
Yeah, so it felt like a huge injustice. Like, everything about the situation felt unfair. It was 4-on-1. It was a surprise attack. I was jumped at night. I was by myself, that kind of thing. I was in flip-flops and sweatpants and a t-shirt, just in a very good mood because we'd had wonderful interactions with our students. And to be clear, none of our students were involved in this. They were victims of this, but none of them were involved in this. This was separate to what we were doing. And so just a lot of it felt incredibly unjust. And I think I have a strong sense of fairness and justice. And so having this happen to me really angered me in the sense that, it wasn't fair in a nutshell. It really went against my sense of fairness. And of course, they knew nothing about me, but the fact that, yes, we were essentially volunteers with a stipend working for this organization out of, in a sense, the goodness of our heart, because we felt inspired by the mission that they were trying to do. And it happened only 2 weeks after we'd arrived in South Africa as well. Just everything about it felt like very frustrating.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Just not knowing how to deal with all those emotions that came up, all those thoughts that would come up, as intrusions. And you were like, I don't like this. I don't know what to do with it. And so then this avoidance, which is really, really common in trauma, took over, you filled that space with food.
Yeah, I'm ex-military as well. I spent 6 years in the Canadian military, in the Navy, and as an engineer. But we're also obviously trained as soldiers too. We're soldiers, first, sailor second, our trade was third. I only share that because I am trained in terms of combat and things like that. And so there were definitely thoughts that entered my head about even things like setting traps, because kind of what happens down there is also, like, clearly we stand out because we are a visible minority, but we were broken into many times as well. And it just compounds it. It feels like you're constantly under attack or under assault when you're living down there for nothing that you've ever done. And so, I had thoughts of setting traps and really trying to even encourage people to break into our house so that I could inflict harm on them and try and exact maybe revenge or vengeance for what had happened to me. But there would always be this voice in my head that goes, this isn't who you are. This is not who you are. This is not what you would do. So I really felt this tension between the sense of identity and who I am as a human being and these things, these thoughts and ideas that were coming into my head that looking back, I believe they were an attempt to try and reconcile something that was taken from me. They really took away my power. They took away, they victimized me and so on. It was almost like my attempt to take back what was taken from me.
When did you recognize, okay, this way of coping with this trauma is not working for me anymore?
Truthfully, it was probably a couple of years after the fact, because some of the other, mitigating factors, I had a sense of an idea of what masculinity was and what it meant to be a man and so on. So that also came into play really in influencing how I felt about everything, including how I felt about myself. Looking back, I realized my whole life I've actually been an empath. I have a very big heart for people, a very big heart of caring and love. But for most of my life, I'd actually kind of hidden and suppressed these things because I felt like if people saw these aspects of my nature and my identity, that they would see me as a weak man, not realizing that, of course, that's a completely flawed idea about it. So that came into it as well. So again, this idea of these huge emotions coming up, and I was seeing myself as this emotional, irrational person when, prior to this, I'd kind of been, my wife used to tease me and even call me the Tin Man a little bit. And so to have all of this and have it outside of my control felt very, very disempowering as well. It was probably, and why I share that backstory is because I didn't really have any idea to even recognize that I was traumatized in a sense. Like, it's after the event, it's like, I'm strong, I can move past this, they're not going to win, and so on. Because of that, I didn't necessarily seek out specific help for this. I just kind of used my own coping skills. But I would say it was probably 6 or 7 months after the fact that I first realized that my weight had ballooned up to 328 pounds. But we got back to Australia, where my wife is from, and realized I can't keep living like this. That time I was 30 years old. Like, I'm 30 years old. Like, this is, if I keep on this path, like, this is going to be a short life for me. That's not what I want. So I have to try to make some changes. But I didn't know what to do to even make changes. And so I started with trying to lose the weight. And prior to that, I'd been an athlete. I've been in pretty good shape most of my life. I'd never really struggled that much with my weight. And so now that was another compounding factor. Here I was. I had this sense of identity as an athlete who was in pretty good shape, who went to the gym regularly, that kind of thing, to now being this obese person who struggled to move. So there was that as well. And along with that came like the self-loathing and self-hatred and feelings of unworthiness and being unlovable and so on. All that sort of came into play as well. And so I started to turn my attention to trying to lose weight, feeling like that would correct some of this stuff that was going on.
How did that go? How did the weight loss journey go for you? Did you try a lot of different diets?
I did. I would say name a diet, and I've probably tried it. Now I imagine like since that time, because there's a period of time where I've like lost weight and kept it off now for a number of years. I would say that, yeah, I tried like paleo, keto. I was even raw vegan for a period of time, low carb, low fat, just a lot of different eating protocols, flexitarian, Mediterranean, and so on. And none of them really could stick. And I couldn't figure out why. Like, I'm pretty well educated. I have a pretty good handle on this. And it was a struggle to try and understand, why could I know all this stuff, but I couldn't seem to make it stick in my own life. I could even help other people. I was good at helping other people. I'm a natural coach, but I couldn't help myself. That went on for a few years of like yo-yo dieting, losing some weight, regaining it, losing it, regaining it. And even that sort of struggle itself, again, compounded everything I felt about myself, about being a failure, about really just, again, being sort of this unlovable loser. Thankfully, my wife is just an amazing human being who was with me and by my side through all of this and never once like lost hope or faith in me, which is a real testament to her character.
I think so many people go through that shame cycle that you're talking about there with, okay, I'm going to do this diet gung-ho and I'm going to get the food and I'm going to plan the meals. And then next thing you know, they're working really hard at it and either they don't see the results that they were expecting to see or they're not able to stick with it. And then it creates this, oh gosh, I'm a failure. I'm never going to lose this weight. I'm just going to be heavy forever. And they just end up in this spiral of negativity. Just makes you want to eat more, really.
Yeah, well, see, the brain had learned a pattern that when I feel stressed or uncomfortable, and anything that I don't want to feel, I can just eat food and change that. A lot of people, and myself included, when we embark on a journey of losing weight and we decide we're going to make this change and transformation, it's very exciting in the beginning because we're starting to picture how we're going to look, how we're going to feel, how life is going to be different. But I think there's this idea that somehow because we're a virtuous or a good person or something, that the universe is going to conspire to create the perfect conditions for us to lose the weight because we're a good person who wants to do a good thing. And the reality is a lot colder than that. Life doesn't stop throwing you curveballs and punching you in the junk when you try to make a change like that. So you actually have to, and I actually had to navigate this attempted transformation in real life while still sort of carrying around the emotional burdens of these beliefs, the trauma, and so on. And then the yo-yo cycle just really perpetuates the cycle of shame, guilt, regret, a sense of failure, and so on. I masked a lot of that with the persona of the jolly fat guy as well, you know? I was even at one point nicknamed the Garburator. That's quite a handle to have.
The Garburator?
Because I could eat a lot of food. I took a sense of pride in my appetite, but also, you know, if there was some good leftovers that somebody had that they were just going to like scrape in the garbage, you know, let's say like a half-eaten steak, I'd just cut off the parts where, you know, maybe their fork and knife had touched. I'd be like, why are you throwing away this good food? If it's going to go to waste, it might as well go to my waste. That was actually my thinking in it. And I think it would physically cause like a pain at my core when I watched food being thrown away that was like perfectly edible and good. And maybe some of that was connected to the fact that for me, food really represented a poor solution to dealing with like my emotional struggles.
How did you find some more positive ways to handle your emotions? What was that process like?
I go back to a coach who asked me a really impactful question that I say legitimately changed my life. And it's interesting to think that one question, when you follow it back, one question can actually change your life. And it started with, he said, if you make a list of all the things you love and value, how far down the list do I have to go before I see your name? And that one stopped me dead in my tracks, because
Wow.
it's like, I'm not on the list. It wasn't even that I was near the bottom. I was not on the list. I think I remember, like, I haven't cried very often in my life. I cried, when I said my wedding vows. That's the only time in my adult life that I really remember, like for most of my adult life, ever shedding tears. Not because I'm ashamed to, I just really hadn't. And that moment, I just, like when I was by myself, I just started crying because I couldn't understand, like it had never entered my consciousness that I was allowed to be on the list of things I love and value, let alone near the top of that list. So it really spoke to how I felt about myself. If I look back, I had this historical pattern of like basically setting myself on fire to keep others warm. Just giving and giving and giving and constantly giving of myself. And I think it really stemmed from a really core of my being, the sense of identity that said, I'm not good enough and I have to do this. Otherwise, people will just, in my life, will just abandon me. That was yet again another contributing factor that made like the weight loss such a struggle. That question was like it at least started the wheels turning that I need to find my way onto this list. And I didn't even know how to do that because it wasn't something that I had ever thought about before. And maybe even I would have felt like a sense of shame around like being given a compliment or being told I was good at something. I'd often just want to like brush that off, even though like I'm quite capable, quite intelligent. If I could say like I'm a good man, a good husband, a good father, a loyal friend, all these things. But if anyone had told me that, I would try to brush it off. I didn't want to receive the compliment graciously because of how I felt about myself, that I didn't feel I was worthy or deserved that.
Just made you really uncomfortable.
It did. It made me squirm in my seat and just really wanted the light to be sort of turned away from me again. One of the things that my coach had me do was to try to pay myself a genuine compliment. Like look at myself in the mirror as I presently was and pay myself a genuine, heartfelt compliment that was grounded in reality. Because in the persona, say, of the jolly fat guy, for example, it would be something that everything was a little bit exaggerated. I was a larger than life kind of character, both physically and in my sort of presence. And I was loud, I was vocal, that kind of thing. It couldn't be this exaggerated compliment because a lot of that is just rooted in insecurity. It had to be a very genuine one. And that process of saying the compliment and then sitting with all the feelings that came up, not trying to push them away, not trying to shoo them away, but just sitting with them, almost like observing them. And so maybe another piece of that puzzle would be when I started practicing meditation. I think it's now shifted, but you go back like 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, the ideas around meditation were it's something for like monks, maybe Buddhist monks in a monastery in the Himalayas or something like that, or you have to burn, or hippies, or you have to burn incense and hum and things like that. Really, it was just about trying to quiet my mind and have a singular focus. And for me, it was actually just a breathing rhythm, box breathing, 4 in, 4 out, 4 hold. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. Mm-hmm. That was the first one. Just something really, really simple to calm the nervous system down. Even learning that practice helped me to start to become more mindful of the thoughts that enter my head. And that was one of the ways that I started to deal with the intrusive thoughts, actually.
I like that. That's really good.
Just as a side note, as a kid, I didn't know what I was doing at the time. Let's say I was laying in bed at night, maybe 5, 6 years old, and had sort of scary thoughts of monsters under my bed or whatever. I would actually visualize the hedgehog driving a bulldozer, and he would push those thoughts out the side of my head, kind of like off the edge of a cliff. So it was this funny little sort of visual tool that I developed as a little child to deal with sort of uncomfortable thoughts in my head.
Okay, that's interesting. So how were you able to forgive the people that hurt you?
That was a process as well, that I made the decision to forgive because I wanted to be free from the experience. Ultimately, I realized that if I was to forgive them, that it was not about absolving them for what they had done, but it was really about setting myself free from what I had experienced. And I got tired of being angry. Rage is exhausting.
Yes.
And it's not fun. Like, it's misery. So it's exhausting misery. And I was just so weary because, again, it was not who I am as a person. I realized that, okay, I have to forgive them. I was in Istanbul living with my brother at the time. We went back to Turkey for a period of time. My brother's lived over there for more than 12 years. And I couldn't sleep one night, and I just got up and I said, okay, I have to start the process of forgiveness. I didn't know what it was going to look like again, but I realized I wanted to forgive them because I wanted to be free. I think what helped me is I had to ask the question, what must have happened in their life or their experience that led them to the place where not only did they think it was appropriate to do what they did, it was actually, they're almost like they were doing a good thing. Like I was the bad guy. Because I don't think, first of all, I don't think that human beings are born racist. And I don't think that they're necessarily born like with this idea that they want to be a violent criminal.
Right.
And so what happened to them in their life, in their experience, that led them to this point in time in their life? I don't know, but it probably wasn't good.
That makes sense.
So I started to develop a sense of compassion for them, which went against my sense of justice at the time. But I realized that, again, I had to humanize them if I was going to forgive them. They couldn't just be like monsters. They had to be humans if I was going to forgive them. And so I really started to reflect on their human experience and what would have brought them to this place. And the other thing I had to realize is I'm a Christian, and I couldn't say forgive them, but kind of secretly hold them at heart. I wish that God would smite them. Like it had to be absolute forgiveness where I actually asked God to forgive them as well, and to not, and to let go of all thoughts and desires for vengeance. It was when I got to that place, and it was a number of months really. Getting to that place was one of the steps I would say in terms of healing and moving past it. And I can say we're actually only a couple of days off the 10-year anniversary of this happening to me. And I'm deeply grateful that I had that experience because of how it has changed me, how I've become a more caring, compassionate, empathetic person. So it didn't turn me into a bitter person. I went through many years of struggles, but because of those struggles, I now have a much deeper understanding of people's humanity and what in their experience. And again, it's not to absolve people of harmful or unhelpful behavior, but it's to understand why that behavior occurs, and understanding that to potentially be an agent for change could be seen in other people's lives as well.
I'm glad that you talked about that being a process of forgiveness, because I think a lot of times people look at it as it should be some kind of like one and done thing. But really, it's a matter of when that anger comes up, dealing with it in that way of saying, okay, let me get over to the space of compassion for others and for understanding that I'm not the one responsible for justice in this sense. That's God's department. And it takes time. Especially when you have big things happen to you, sometimes that forgiveness is a process.
Yeah, and you're right about, like, I couldn't just sort of make the decision to forgive and then be free. It's that every time my brain wanted to revisit what happened to me, you highlighted exactly, really, to move into that space of compassion, to say, like, I don't want this anger, and really asking God to help me to let go of it. And also, like, not feeling necessarily a sense of guilt for the thoughts that entered my head, because I didn't want them. I didn't want them there. But there was this period of time where I felt really conflicted, even with these thoughts entering my head, because I thought, well, these are sinful thoughts. These are harmful thoughts. They're not thoughts that a Christian should have entering their head, thoughts of carrying out violence and harming other people. Even letting go of the guilt that I felt for that, realizing that this was kind of my brain's response to trying to reconcile what had happened to me. And that, like, in this experience, God was taking me through this experience. There's no shortcut. I think sometimes maybe there's this desire that we try to be a Christian and try to serve God, but there's this desire that somehow this will allow us to short circuit or shortcut the experience. But if I was to take a shortcut around the experience, I would miss a lot of the value of that experience. And that's not to say that I want to go through something like that again. I don't. But it was because I went through the painful experience. It's like almost like we have to get to like the lowest of lows to realize like how deep God's love for us is. And we can't really know it or feel it until we get to that place.
Wow, that's a good point. So tell us a little bit about what you do in terms of the nutrition coaching and your work with clients.
Yeah, so that originally started out about 6 or 7 years ago when I had a nutrition and supplement store, so a physical bricks and mortar store. And so people would come in looking for a particular supplement to help them with a particular issue. I said that I started to become a bartender without alcohol. And so people would come into the store and they would just start sharing their struggles. I would ask questions. Hey, you're looking for this supplement to help. What's going on? Let's try to understand this a little bit more. And very often I end up saying, you know what, actually, you're welcome to buy that if you want to, but like, I just want you to know that that's probably not going to help you with what it is you're trying to get help with. And maybe I point them in the direction of another supplement to help them, but ultimately I ended up coaching people. So I started, maybe I started out giving people calorie recommendations and meal plans and things, because that was what I thought people needed. But as time went on, I realized that those were really just like Band-Aid approaches. But really now I do what I call like brain-driven weight loss. And I'd almost like to call it, say, like the side effect might include weight loss. In other words, the process that we're really working on is one of transformation, and that actually means a permanent shift in identity. The idea behind a diet is a temporary change to create permanent results, and that's never going to be the case. If we're going to create lasting change, we have to be transformed. Really, it's about walking people through that process, because so human beings, we don't really create change on our own. It's really difficult because we feel lonely and isolated. But when we feel connected to another safe human being, if I could put it that way, it then is safe for us, because the process of change is vulnerable. It's moving out of our comfort zone. It's moving into the discomfort zone. It involves growing. Think about like when a snake goes to shed its skin, as an animal kingdom example. It goes to a place where it will be safe and secure, because in that time that it's going through that process, it's insecure, so to speak. So we can understand that a little bit, that like when we go to transform, we're moving into a vulnerable state. And biologically, our brain doesn't like that, because we have these hardwired sort of primal survival mechanisms. And so what needs to happen is we need to be in a safe space, so to speak, where it feels like it's safe to transform, because we're connected to another secure human being. And so really there's a relational aspect of the coaching that I'm doing, is essentially holding space for somebody and then guiding them through that process. Yes, we're essentially going to reverse engineer. So we understand the fundamental principles of a healthy lifestyle. It really hasn't changed because our biology really hasn't changed. It's that part of it is relatively simple. It's the human part that makes it complex. And so we walk people through the process of building out the foundation steps, or building out the foundation pieces, and then learning how to implement these skills into their lives so they actually become a habit or a routine behavior. So in the process of doing so, one of the things we need to do is bring a lot of our unconscious habits and behaviors into our conscious awareness, because it's the place of awareness that we can create change. And I like to add to that and say it's really the place of compassionate awareness that helps us to create change. We almost do two things. We take the unconscious habits that are unhelpful, bring them to our conscious awareness, refine them, and then we transfer them back into sort of our unconscious mind by practicing these behaviors, until ultimately what we've done is we've crafted a lifestyle that suits the individual, so that not only do they lose the weight, but because it's become their way of living, and there's also been a transformation in their identity, they can keep doing this, because ultimately that's what's required to truly create change.
I like that concept of changing from the inside out, one, and two, to make major changes, having to change your identity, how you view yourself. And so many people are looking at themselves in the mirror saying, well, maybe like you, like, okay, well, I'm the jolly, happy, fat guy. And that really was your identity. And until you could see yourself differently, your subconscious essentially was like, we have to hold on to this weight. I mean, because we're the jolly, fat guy. Like, that's who we are. And so until you can start to see yourself differently, your body isn't going to fall in line with those changes that you're trying to make. That makes so much sense.
Well, it's really interesting because there's like this, could we say, a dynamic tension. So our primal nervous system is really hardwired to seek out comfort and familiarity, because that's where safety lies. But our soul, the essence of who we are as a human, yearns for growth and development and bettering ourselves. There's just this urge or drive. And so there's this tension between these two forces that are kind of pulling back and forth. You probably heard the phrase that we don't really change until the discomfort of remaining the same outweighs the discomfort of creating change.
Right. Just kind of as a closing question, if you could go back in time, what encouragement or hope would you provide to your younger self?
You can get through this. Human beings are immensely resilient, but we have to believe and have faith in the fact that we are. It is incredible what we can endure and move forward in. But the other thing is, like, there is an end to this. There is light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to be a difficult and a painful experience, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. The thing I would say is there is no shame in seeking help.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one.
It's the most beneficial thing I ever did, was to open up and ask others for help. And it's incredible the kindness that human beings will show you when you open yourself up to receiving help.
Coach Jon, thank you so much for being on the podcast and talking about your personal story. I think that that's really powerful and something probably a lot of people can relate to. Maybe they didn't go through the exact trauma that you went through, but they went through something difficult and used food to cope, or are emotional eating even currently. And maybe they can kind of pick up some tips from things that you shared of how to start heading in a new direction. So that's awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And just to encourage anybody who might be struggling with things, it's okay. Your brain is just doing what it's kind of designed to do. We just need to work with your brain. The brain is wonderfully plastic. It's called neuroplasticity. We can essentially rewire our brain. And so even if you feel stuck in these patterns, that can be changed. There is hope for you.
Yes, for sure. I wanted to take a moment to give a couple of shout outs. One is to Betty. Thank you for being our first patron on Patreon. If you, like Betty, would like to support the show, you can click on the link in our show notes. I also want to say a thank you to Emily for writing us an encouraging note and letting us know what the podcast has meant to her. She said that she found the podcast during a difficult time in her life and now considers us to be one of her top 3 favorite podcasts. So that's awesome. It's so encouraging to hear from our listeners. So thank you for everybody out there who's listening. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling. Our show is hosted by me, Carrie Bach, licensed professional counselor in Tennessee. Opinions given by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself or By the Well Counseling. Our original music is by Brandon Mangroom. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.